Hello, faithful. This week we have a special two-part episode, this time with Bernie Sanders' 2020 Deputy Campaign Manager, Ari Rabin-Havt. Few people know more about what was going on internally in the campaign than Ari, and he is here to answer some of the questions that have been percolating around the internet about where the campaign went wrong and what lessons the left can take going forward, particularly in light of Senator Nina Turner's recent loss in Ohio's 11th district. Ari and I spoke for 2.5 hours, so we've split this up into two parts. We've decided to make this Monday episode a public episode so everyone can hear the natural beginning of this interview, and then put part 2 as our Thursday episode, which will be a premium episode. You can access part 2 to this interview by going to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and subscribing for $5 a month. We really appreciate your support. It enables me to do things like travel to Cleveland last week and cover Senator Turner's campaign in person, so I could understand what was really happening on the ground outside of the media spin. So thank you for that. And without further ado, let's get to the episode. Should he have done more to try to get concessions out of him at that point when Joe Biden needed his support the most?
I think, was Bernie willing to go for the jugular against Joe Biden? He is someone who believes I can run on this positive message.
Well, do you feel like now, after two, successful in many respects, but ultimately losing campaigns, if there's been any reflection on whether or not it's worth it to take the so-called high ground and lose?
In the beginning of the campaign, January, February, March, April, May, I had a reporter at a major news outlet literally tell me that his bosses don't want to spend the money covering Bernie.
There is an attitude taken toward activists that to be a healthcare activist in this moment in a Biden administration is to be some kind of cuckoo pants person who's out of touch with reality. I am joined here today at Bad Faith headquarters, LOL, my apartment in DC, with
Bad Faith Central.
Bad Faith Central, with Ari Rabin-Havt, who was a deputy campaign manager for the Bernie Sanders campaign. Now, Ari, it's been over a year now since the campaign ended.
Yep.
Somehow it feels like it was just yesterday, based on how the discourse continues to ask and turn over the same questions over and over again. Principally, what happened? How did Bernie lose? Especially in light of the fact that we're recording just a few days after Senator Nina Turner lost her race to win Ohio, to be the representative of Ohio's 11th district. And it seems that people are perceiving there to be certain overlaps between what happened in each of these campaign efforts. I know you weren't a part of Senator Turner's campaign.
I was a proud supporter and donor. That was my role for S&T.
Okay, but to the extent that there are lessons to be learned from the Sanders campaign that perhaps were not internalized, what went down?
Look, I think with S&T, let's start there and work backwards. And this does relate to the Bernie campaign. I do not think we can underestimate what the establishment will do to keep a progressive from power. In the case of the Bernie campaign, you look back over it, there's both the remarkable and the sad. And what I mean by remarkable, and I think I have to start with this context. On October 1st, I was sitting in a hospital room in Las Vegas. We were in 4th place in Iowa. At that, the Des Moines Register poll had come out like a week or two before. We were in 4th place in Iowa. Elizabeth Warren, 4 or 5 days later, it's amazing how this stuff claws into your brain and never leaves. 4 or 5 days later, which meant basically polling from that day because those polls were in the field. So these were pre-heart attack metrics. 4 or 5 days later, Elizabeth Warren in the Real Clear Politics average crisscrosses Joe Biden for her one day where she was a centimeter on. It was 0.5% or so. I'm probably getting that wrong. People can scream at me, but it was just a teeny bit. It wasn't even a point above. It was like she touched above him and started to decline almost immediately. And we went from there, which was basically behind Mayor Pete in Iowa, 3rd place nationally, to a campaign that won the plurality of the vote in Iowa, won New Hampshire, blew out Nevada, finished second with 20% of the vote in South Carolina, which we can talk about South Carolina. And, and then let's talk about Super Tuesday, because I think that all connects. But to basically be a campaign that post Nevada, you had the entire, to go from literally out of it to front row with your candidate in the hospital, who's a 78-year-old Jewish socialist. That's like the ride up. And then we do have to take into account the ride down.
Right.
So
I noticed that you skipped over Iowa as you laid out those wins.
Well, plurality of the vote in Iowa.
Well, right. Some people will want me to ask, what happened in Iowa? Because they feel as though the campaign should have challenged the results there more, especially in light of the app that was used to do the vote tallies. I had these connections to the Pete Buttigieg campaign. What happened there, and what was the decision-making process about not making more of a stir about perhaps some untoward behavior in Iowa?
This I am like here are the problems with that, and I think this is so we get out of Iowa. We have the plurality of the vote because of this really stupid undemocratic system where you can have these state delegate equivalents are the metric that's about geography and this, and it's the person who wins the most votes should win. That's not the way Iowa works. There were substantive issues in Iowa, and there have always been substantive issues in Iowa. What exposed those substantive issues, first of all, was the insistence of Bernie people on the Unity Reform Commission way back 2 years before that the actual raw vote totals be public. And Iowa had always resisted raw vote totals being public. And what the raw vote total shows is Bernie won unquestionably the raw vote totals. Now there are questions of what happened in this precinct, what happened in this precinct, what happened in this precinct. So the question is, why don't you challenge that? Right. I think here's the thought process on that. And you come out of there, that kind of appeals process, let's say you were going to challenge that takes a long time, right? It's not going to make a difference in the a total delegate count. If it came down to 2 delegates between us and Mayor Pete, or 2 delegates at the convention, you're damn right they'd start to challenge it. But you didn't even have to challenge it at that point, right?
I think the argument is that it's a narrative framing tool, right? To be able to say Bernie won the first 3 states and then Biden won South Carolina is a stronger case, a stronger pushback against.
We wouldn't have had an answer if we'd started challenging it, because those SDEs, then there's this process that play out over several months, that go from state how you challenge it is you challenge it within points in the process. And these things used to be from memory with me, but to go from state delegate equivalents to actual delegates at the national convention, there are a series of process points.
But do you see what I'm saying? That it's more about being able to say, for example, the evening of the Iowa vote, Pete Buttigieg hops on TV and says, "I won."
Right. And then we hopped out and we're we won.
Right. But there always does seem to be a greater appetite for certain players that tend to fall on the establishment side of things, for making claims, for kind of controlling that narrative battle.
Well, I think I think first off, there was at no point the campaign itself didn't say we won Iowa.
Sure.
And engage in that narrative battle. And I think had it been necessary, there's 2 sides of this. So let's split them up. And I think this is actually important. There's the challenging the legally and procedural. It's not legal. It's more procedurally challenging the delegate totals, right? Okay. Challenge. So that's what I was kind of referring to. That's a process that plays out. If you want to take that route, that's a process that plays out over time. And by the way, we did the appeals that happened immediately. We did do that, which there was you need to recount this. We're challenging that. That actually was challenged on Monday, Tuesday. What's it? No, it's okay.
It's lost to the.
They were challenged over the few days, but then there's a further legal challenge on rhetorically challenge. I don't think there was a moment. At least every time I spoke to the press in that moment, and every time I think everyone I saw, and I can't speak for everyone in the world because a million things are going on. I would just say we won Iowa, and I wouldn't even couch it as I do now for accuracy, which is the plurality of the vote. At that point, I would just say we won Iowa.
Yeah.
And Bernie, by the way, would say we won Iowa. So rhetorically, I think we were there. But let's get to this point of like what happened to
What
Bernie.
happened?
To Bernie. And I think fundamentally what happened, and some of this relates to Senator Turner's campaign. It's interesting because I'm so used to calling her Senator Turner that I hope she becomes Representative Turner. I hope that, like, obviously it's not going to happen in this race. I hope one day it happens, but will I have to demote her with the new title?
Right.
What happened was, if you looked at a plan to win, for Bernie to win the nomination, right? Which is fundamentally a delegate math thing. There's a national narrative, which is one step, but then the nomination is won basically by delegate math in the end. Part of it is we had to do what we did in Iowa and New Hampshire, then definitely do what we did in Nevada, right? Win the plurality vote in Iowa, win New Hampshire, blow out Nevada, right? The hope is, with South Carolina structurally is a very difficult state for Bernie.
Why is that?
To win. It's
larger.
It's not just larger, it's a much more, the electorate is more conservative, is more driven. And they're not conservative like conservative Republicans, but within the Democratic spectrum of the Democratic Party, it's a more conservative electorate. It's an older, and this is the piece of it, it's an older electorate.
Right.
Which is bad. Like, older electorates were bad for Bernie, period. And so
yeah, go ahead.
So the moment Joe Biden wins South Carolina, the question is, he does, it's difficult to get Democrats to unite on anything. Except in this case, it was to get the Democratic Party united behind, to get the moderates and the conservative Democrats to unite behind defeating Bernie in that 48 hours to it's been reported Obama's role in convincing Mayor Pete to drop out, to get Amy Klobuchar to drop out, which affects Minnesota. Right. I'm going to leave the Elizabeth Warren stuff to the side because, frankly, I actually think that mattered less than people thought it did.
We'll come back to Elizabeth Warren.
I think that mattered less in terms of our vote than people thought it did. But you leave Mayor Pete in the race, you leave Amy Klobuchar in the race, the map looks substantially different. Right. And that map ends with us basically sweeping all the delegates in California, probably winning Texas, likely winning Massachusetts, likely winning Oklahoma. If Minnesota, we might be second still, but we'd probably be behind Amy Klobuchar and not Joe Biden. It's a different map coming out of there. Right. And then because of the way delegates are proportionally allocated, But that's so.
Ari, everyone, I think that people really do appreciate the fact that there was a coalescing among moderates driven by Barack Obama reportedly that changed the map and the outcome for us.
That's not it. That's. But you're asking me why. But
the question still remains: isn't that something that we have to anticipate?
Yes.
And when Bernie Sanders is talking about how we're going to have to go up against every interest and it's going to be an uphill battle and how hard it's going to be, it feels like that kind of a maneuver is ultimately part of the equation.
Yes, and that's what happened with Senator Turner. In her thing. You see a coalition of third way, of Democratic majority for Israel, which we can talk about. And I can tell you some stories about them from the campaign that people have not heard, because there's one story that I'll tell you here that people haven't heard, which is interesting. I think you see that coalescing in the last 2 to 3 weeks, where you see first you see Shontel Brown in what is the very definition of corrupt, let's be clear, doing that whole red box strategy, which is unbelievable.
What is the red box strategy?
The red box strategy is, it's like, hey, it's how you so they release basically a page of talking points, and then you basically say, this is for you, super PACs, to use as your messaging. And The Intercept wrote about this, and it's basically because you can't coordinate with them, which means you can't communicate in private. But if everybody can see it on the internet, it's public, which is basically what they did, which is legal. But it's like the super PAC laws that I don't think people understand how corrupt the super PAC laws are. They have a sense of corruption. They don't have a sense of like how corrupt they are in that. I'll give you an example. A sitting member of the Senate or Congress is only allowed to ask for the maximum FEC contribution, right? So $2,800 right now. So that's all. But what they could do is a sitting member of Congress could go into a super PAC fundraiser and say, hello, billionaires, how are you doing today? This super PAC is a really good group of people. I love Mark Mellman and Democratic Majority for Israel. They're awesome. You should give them $2,800. And then the candidate, and this literally I don't know, it probably did not happen in this case, actually. So it probably did not happen in the Chantel Brown case. It definitely does happen in other cases. The candidate walks off the stage, leaves the room, gets in their car and drives away. And then the head of the super PAC gets up and goes, what that person actually meant was $280,000. Let's see your checks roll in. But we have the backing of, we have the sign off of fill in big political figure, left or right. And I mean, Democrat or Republican, more less than left or right. We're the super PAC with the checkbox that we represent that. So donating to us, which is a public, like, remember, there are two types, and this gets confused also. There are like two types of super PAC contributions. There's like, if you contribute to a super PAC, that's a public contribution. When you want to hide it, you contribute to a 501c4 that feeds into a super PAC, and that's how people hide them. But there are people who publicly want, like, I want my name listed so X member knows I contributed to their super PAC. And in an age where, and I don't actually think any of this existed in the Chantel Brown-Nina Turner race. It did exist in our race, and in a variety of ways. Like when there are single member super PACs, meaning the super PAC's only job is to like call for the election or defeat of a single candidate. You got to know, like, it's just such a, I'm sorry for this side note, but I actually do think it's important to understand
it is important.
The level of corruption here. But in this case, look, you had, and I don't know what the conversation was inside Senator Turner's campaign, obviously. But I do think they anticipate, I definitely think they had to have anticipated.
So here's the thing. So here's where the conversation is.
Yeah.
A lot of people push back against the discourse that's been happening over the last couple of days that says, what felled Senator Turner was all of this super PAC spending, all this dark money spending, because she was able to raise a comparable amount of money through individual donations. And so her grassroots fundraising was actually very strong. And so they say, well, she has to deal with the fact it was even Stevens, kind of equating those two buckets of money. What's your response to that? Because it does seem to be a real crisis point for progressives. Because for a long time, the belief was at least that it wasn't possible to keep up, and that one of the biggest obstacles to getting progressives in office was that we were never going to be able to match the spending of people whose interest, whose political platform aligned with corporate elites who are very well funded. Now, both the Bernie campaign and the Senator Turner campaign show that we can ostensibly keep up kind of dollar for dollar, even if it's on the backs of all of these poor and working class people. But if you're still going to end up losing, because it's an outside group who can do a kind of more targeted, aggressive ad than arguably a campaign can do, because you can still get out fundraised by them. I think
there's something else that we have to take into account.
But just to stay on this for just one moment.
No, but this is on this, because I think it's one of the answers to the question.
Okay, so what do we do about the fact that even when we can keep up fundraising-wise, you still manage to lose?
Here is part of the problem I see. I was talking to a former colleague of ours last night about, we were kind of both being a little depressed about Senator Turner, and we were talking about this, and it does relate to our race. And I think we underestimate, and I think this is progressives across the board and leftists with our candidates, how much Democratic primaries in particular have become a kind of, and I'm going to use a word, and it's not defined the way you think I'm defining it, and then I'm going to have to jump back and define it. Okay. How much of it is an identity game? And I don't mean that in the traditional how we cite identity politics. So take that definition to the side. But what I mean is, like, one of the blocks we had with the Democratic primary electorate with Bernie is that Bernie was not a Democrat and would not really identify as such. That was an actual block in, I actually think it would help us in a general election, but it was a block in the Democratic primary election. I think with the super PAC spending against Senator Turner, the main message I saw out of that, like, that's why nobody actually believes that Senator Turner's against the minimum wage. Nobody believes she's against Medicare for all. That's ludicrous. What they were communicating was not that. What they were communicating in every communication, it seemed to me looking in from the outside, was she's not a Democrat. She hates, she might, and this is actually a problem we face because we win on issues, right? But we as leftists, as progressives, only in the context of Democratic primaries and only in the context of like hotly debated Democratic primaries, are often viewed as outside of Team Blue, right? We don't wear the right jersey. And therefore, they know there's a section of voters that, it's not the whole slice of the electorate. There is, though, a section of voters that does that. I think also, look, in the Senator Turner race, from what I have seen from online discourse, and we're probably reading some of the same things, I think you look at that and you see that, like, the areas of the district that were African-American seem to have voted for Senator Turner.
Correct.
The areas of the district that were white seem to have voted for Shontel Brown. And, like, we don't have the gooey full data yet, but it does seem like what there was a success in was convincing wealthier, whiter voters, which, by the way, is what happened in South Carolina.
Correct.
Also with Bernie.
100%.
Convincing wealthier, whiter voters that they needed to come out in a primary that they wouldn't necessarily come out with to prevent this person who is, it's not even that she's progressive. The attack wasn't that she's progressive because that's not a successful, notice they didn't say Nina Turner supports a $15 an hour minimum wage. Their attack ad was Nina Turner opposes a $15 an hour minimum wage, which, by the way, I just have to say, like, knowing Senator Turner, it's the gaslighting on a, like, it's just so
Herculean degree.
Like, she would, like, the things she would do to get Medicare for all in a $15. You and I both know that she would be unstoppable on those two things.
Of course.
But you convince those voters not but that she is outside of this team that you are a part of and you are a part of, and she's bringing in these and the people that she's going to bring into the party are outside this team.
Right. And you saw that very clearly in some of these ads where, there was one in particular where they touted Hillary Clinton's endorsement, but they had a picture of Hillary Clinton with John Lewis in the ad. So if you're just flipping through the channels, the implication is what it is. Moreover, Ohio is an open primary. It is an open primary. Yeah. And I, spoke to one voter who was a white voter, and as much as you can tell these things upon interacting with someone, seemed to be more affluent, who explicitly said, I don't want to vote for Nina Turner because she reminds me of AOC. I think that AOC and the rest of those squad members are a problem. They need to stop fighting with Democrats and let the infrastructure bill go through.
They need to stop fighting with Democrats. And look, I think we underestimate progressives and leftists. We look at polling, right? And the polling says the electorate is with us on Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. The electorate is with us on $15 an hour minimum wage. Mm-hmm. The electorate is with us on the Democratic primary electorate, though most of these things, the entire electorate, on student debt. The electorate is with us on ending wars. The electorate, like, you just go down issue after issue after issue. But that primary electorate, the thing they care more about in all of these races, not everyone is equal, and we have to talk about different layers. The thing they end up caring more about is, are you on our team? Do you wear our jersey? Okay. And then you have, and this doesn't speak for everyone because there are deep divisions, but I do think it's not even an underestimation, because on the Bernie campaign, frankly, we knew about it from before the election. There were conversations with Bernie in 2018 where one person in particular, I'm going to leave out of it because I feel it's only fair to say who it was, trying to get very aggressive with Bernie about this one person tried to get very aggressive with Bernie about, hey, you should become a Democrat. You should announce yourself as a member of the Democratic Party. You should do that. And, the thing about Bernie is, and I think this is one thing that just people kind of know it, but they don't believe it in a way. In terms of even our supporters, is Bernie and does the things that Bernie wants to do.
Yeah, people should really take that lesson to heart. For those of you who think that I or Ari or anybody else had the control over
Bernie is
the campaign.
Bernie is Bernie, and Bernie runs the campaign he wants. And by the way, that's part of why I love him, because he's not Mayor Pete who will just read anything written off a
right. And I would argue, if anyone asked my opinion about these things, that for him to announce that he was a Democrat in advance of running undermines the one thing about him that everyone loves, which is his consistency and his ideological kind of groundedness. And no one would believe it anyway. Becoming a Democrat in the 11th hour it's not worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
Yeah, and if Bernie's, and my argument also is take Bernie Sanders and make him a Democrat for 25 years. Make him start his career as a Democrat, and everything's the same till he runs for president. His 2015 campaign is probably about as successful as Martin O'Malley's. In that case, it's just not. It doesn't. Part of the magic of Bernie is that he was above the process.
I agree, but here's the issue, Ari.
Okay,
it is not a mystery that getting people to see Bernie as a team player, or at least someone who's not hostile to the Democratic Party's interests, is going to be part of this game. It's not a mystery that you need to figure out how to get some older voters and not just hope that magically, for the first time in American history, the young voters that overwhelmingly support Bernie are going to become 60% of the electorate. None of this stuff is a mystery. And there were conversations being had within the campaign at a certain point about things like, how do you frame Bernie Sanders is the person who is best able to beat Trump. The kind of messages that you knew were galvanizing people more than some of this other party politics-y kind of stuff.
Agree.
But it didn't feel like, if we're going to be honest with ourselves as people who are both members of this team, this is not a blame game. No. But my perception was it did not feel like, though that was the emphasis. Heading into South Carolina, I remember having discussions about the ads that were going to run on TV. And it was, okay, there's a former Biden official who flipped to become a Bernie official. And that was the ad. And it's like, well, we don't need to talk about Black issues per se. We don't need to talk about a lot of the stuff that was being focused on, these policy issues, as much as I love them and think the polls are useful. What people cared about was beating Donald Trump.
Yes.
And so why weren't we hitting that harder? Why weren't we hitting older voters harder, talking about Social Security? And ultimately, we had the volley of negative ads back and forth about the Social Security issue. But why wasn't that a bigger part of the narrative to try to attack Biden before it was too late?
First off, Social Security is actually an interesting one. I think people misunderstand one part about Social Security politics. So, voters above 65, and this is buried out in the data, when you do major pushes on Social Security, voters above 65 actually don't care. Because they're I got it, I ain't losing it.
Okay, but it's not like we were killing it in that 45 to 65 demographic.
You hit the 45 to 65 demographic which is where there was the Social Security fight and some other things. I think that, the question is, if we're looking for and I don't have the answer there, because if I did, if I had a better answer, I would have pitched it among I think the other thing people don't realize, I think you can speak to this as well, is it's not like any one of us had dictatorial control other than Bernie Sanders.
Is that typical? How atypical is that from other campaigns? I don't know if you have any insight into that.
I would say the candidate always runs the campaign. How much the candidate runs the campaign is always the question. So you have different setups of that. And what I mean is you have the, let's call it the John Kerry 04 setup, which was a team of consultants kind of dictating the campaign and screwing it up, right? In the case of Hillary, you had a very tiny triumvirate at the top, Podesta, Robbie Mook, Jen Palmieri, a few others kind of running it, and Hillary being more involved than just a potted plant. That's not Hillary, right? She was actually involved. But knowing that her role as candidate is to sell it. Bernie, here's the other thing I think people don't appreciate about Bernie that I think is Bernie doesn't just want people to believe in his brand of issues. That's not the only form. He wants people to believe in his methodology he wants to win on his methodology of politics. Right?
Which is to turn out this multiracial working class.
To go out to speak to people directly, to talk about, it is to go out to speak to people directly, to talk about issues, and to turn out a multi-generational, multi-issue, working class, multiracial coalition that he kind of...
Based on talking about the issues and not talking about the fact that he's the best person to be...
Which I would say Trump. During the campaign, first off, he would talk about... He would talk about... it's not sometimes.
Some infographics. I pushed him.
Yes, you pushed him. And in nearly every speech, he had some refrain about that. And look, as a campaign, so we launched in March with the kind of series of rallies where he talked about his background, right? Which is also very hard to push Bernie to talk about his personally. The second kind of series of rallies was literally the entire structure of that series of rallies was about how Bernie beats Trump. And
Bernie beats Trump, it was on bumper stickers for sure.
And we would do, our Iowa program, in part, a lot of our travel in Iowa, if you look at where we were going and what we were doing and how we were thinking about Iowa, was we were going to a ton of Trumpish areas in Iowa. We didn't spend a lot of time in Des Moines, right? We spent a lot of time in Trumpish areas of the state, especially we spent a bunch of time in the northwest corner of the state, which is Steve King's district. For people in that area, going to these small towns and going to places like Okoboji, Iowa, and places like that to do events that are, with the idea and to communicate in the press in terms of travel schedule, which, as you know, was one of my things where I had a big role in the campaign. I had a lot of big roles in the campaign, but it's one of the things where I was very focused on because it was part of my responsibilities, was to communicate that message that we are a campaign that can go into these areas. We are a campaign. There was a reason we did in the end of the summer went to Kentucky.
Right. But all right, here's the thing. I'm not gonna dispute the idea that Bernie beats Trump wasn't a message that was hit. The problem was that folks ultimately felt like if Bernie Sanders is agreeing that Biden can also beat Trump, then that's not an argument for Bernie.
Then you're getting into a different problem, a different issue here, where and this was a different issue, and this is a whole different thing, and which is not were we communicating the message that Bernie beats Trump, but was Bernie willing to go for the jugular against Joe Biden? And look, I think it has been clear throughout the campaign, Bernie, as I stated, Bernie believes in not only running campaigns, not only running on issues, but running campaigns in a certain way. And he's a great counterpuncher, which you saw at the second debate in Detroit, that's where I wrote the damn bill came from, where he was attacked and he was like, okay, time to whip out the machine gun and mow all you guys down on stage who are doing this to me, because I'm not going to sit here and take it. But he is someone who believes I can run on this positive message. I can run on this. And he did not. Look, there's been plenty of coverage of this, right? There's plenty of staff. And look, I have kind of an ethos as a staff member that I don't kind of reveal my kind of advice to the candidate ever, because I just feel like that's part of what goes on behind. But there has been a number of stories, I think, out there about a number of staff members who have been very public about their advice to the candidate.
They certainly have been.
That they have to go for the jugular. And I do remember moments during the campaign. And look, it wasn't I do remember moments during the campaign where they said, we want you to do X, Y, and Z. And take it as it is. Those stories are out there, basically.
Well,
And
do you feel like now, after two, successful in many respects, but ultimately losing campaigns, that there's been any reflection on whether or not it's worth it to take the so-called high ground and lose?
My question is not, I have a different kind of formulation in my head. There's one thing when there's like a strategy about like, should we run X points here of television versus Y, do field here versus spend money here? That's to one side. What I have seen throughout my time in politics is when you have a political candidate and you try to make them do something, and they do something they are fundamentally uncomfortable with, and you make it kind of a core thing, even if it's the right strategy, they can't carry it.
Well, what about asking surrogates to do it? Because that was the other thing about Bernie Sanders, is that he had some of perhaps the most powerful roster of surrogates you could ever imagine and want. And it felt like, because of certain logistical issues and hurdles that had to be jumped through and sign off that was required from the top, that they were never really empowered to say or do much. So you have someone like Ariana Grande, who most Americans probably don't even know was a Bernie Sanders endorser, who also, I believe, has more Instagram followers than anybody else in the world, or is like top 5 or whatever.
There are 2 layers of surrogates, and let me.
Let's just finish this point real quick. The idea that you have Bernie Sanders coming on stage with her in Atlanta in this moment, that's really cool. But then you don't have, say, Ariana Grande posting that Bernie Sanders is the only candidate in the race that wants to cancel all student debt. And when I go around the country still to this day, encounter people who have no idea that Bernie Sanders had as part of his platform a plan to cancel, exclusively the plan to cancel all student debt. That to me feels like a lot of lost opportunities. And we're not even getting into Cardi B and, Killer Mike and Cornel West and all of these people.
So I think there are different layers of surrogates. Mm-hmm. Let's separate them out. There's like the Ariana Grande Cardi B layer. Let's put that over here, right? And there's like a Cornel West, and I put Killer Mike in this category. Sure. Cornel West, Killer Mike, who are like, they're basically part of the campaign.
Sure.
And you could call Cornel West and be like, hey,
tweet this.
Hey, Dr. West, can you do this?
But Cornel West doesn't have the Twitter following of a Dua Lipa.
Right. Hey, Killer Mike, can you tweet this? Was Dua Lipa was she during the campaign or was that after?
It might have been toward the end, but I remember I seem to recall part of that concert series that was digital concert series happening at the end, that she was a part of us by then.
So like with the kind of super celeb category, this is the Ariana Grande, the Cardi B. I think people assume, and look, that those I do not like doing the celebrity communications. I actually, when like most of the time when celebrity, other than Eddie Vedder, who was like, when I was like, in 7th grade was like my hero. So when I got the chance to meet Eddie Vedder during the campaign, I completely was a fanboy. I would just ignore. The only other person like that was Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth, where I was like,
well, if that was the issue, if that were the issue, I would be more than happy to reach out to. That wasn't. But as I understand it from the people who did that, who had that kind of, that's not who I am. I'm not like a celebrity. Right. I don't know how to do that job. That's actually a job that there are people with expertise in who do. When you have like the super celebs like Ariana Grande and Cardi B, like you reach out and it's not like, it's like 17 layers of like managers and agents and CAA and this agency and that agency and this. And I do know that, like, for example, so Ariana Grande, we were outside of Las Vegas doing debate prep and like we literally heard out of like nowhere that Ariana Grande wants to see Bernie at his concert. And we literally ran out and ran to the plane to get there and like took off for like Atlanta to like, we like ended debate prep and like skedaddled to get on the plane, like went right over to like the Cardi B, the Ariana Grande concert. I just remember they went to like meet her. I like ran up, was upstairs like in the concert venue. Actually, I wasn't in that meeting actually.
but I do like from what I understand with her, there was additional like, and I don't know this. I actually don't have firsthand knowledge of.
Mm-hmm.
There was outreach to do X, Y, and Z, and after that first meeting, there wasn't the ability because of bureaucracy or other things to get anything real. And people and artists are kind of, the artists themselves, when you can get to them, are very willing to do things, but when they're surrounded by like their flappers, they're all very cautious, and most of that industry, the artists might be Bernie supporters, but the
industry doesn't want to do that. And I understand that. Taylor Swift has been kind of open about how much pushback she's gotten from wanting to do political things. That's kind of out in the ether. But you're telling me that Bernie Sanders and Ariana Grande didn't exchange numbers such that Bernie could reach out directly for a favor?
I actually don't know the answer.
And if not, come on, this is what we have to be doing.
But I have to say, I wasn't in that, as I just said. When I was not there, I don't know if they did. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I just don't know the answer to that question.
So one other thing that I remember was that I remember being told that the issue with using Cardi B more, because she is someone who has been very kind of openly, going to the beat of her own drum and saying and doing things. I mean, the way that she acquired fame was not traditional in the least. She's always been kind of an Instagram reality star, kind of a presence whose charm is that she is not boxed in and controlled, including the way that she came out in her support for Bernie back in 2016 or whatever.
Yes. Vote for Daddy
Bernie, right? So someone like Cardi B, also, my understanding was that part of why she didn't end up doing more for the campaign was because there was kind of a push for her to do some musical concert things that require a lot of preparation and money and, lighting and band members and staff and stuff, where she was much more receptive to doing things where she just spoke about her political commitments, which required less of her team.
I would say, from my perspective, the first half of the question, I had the opposite reaction. I, as the person who was responsible for was the person ultimately responsible at the campaign. There was a huge team of advance, which the Bernie advance are some of the most amazing people you will ever meet. They were all out a bunch. I was sad I wasn't in Cleveland because a bunch of them had come out to help out Senator Turner in her final days. But that staff that puts that together, the staff that I worked closest with on the campaign was that staff. I was always very skeptical about putting on, and had a very high bar for musical events at the campaign. And because of what you just laid out, there's and people don't understand this, there's an artist, the artist will play for free, right?
Right.
But you have to pay,
all the infrastructure.
The campaign itself has to pay the crew, because that's a union crew that works for them, that they're not, that's a donation. They're not, even if they wanted to, they shouldn't volunteer. We should pay them. They're union guys, right? And they're legally not allowed to volunteer, but it's the right thing. It's not,
right.
So musicians, crew, and all that. So a Cardi B concert for the campaign would have cost about $250,000.
Right.
Which is why I have to, but
my understanding was that the asks, she kept, and again,
I honestly don't know.
My understanding is that there was some openness and ability to do more like the sit down event that ended up happening in the nail salon.
That's the type of thing. Now,
which I think was extremely effective.
And my personal preference, by the way, was always, I don't know, because once again, I was not the person recruiting celebrities. So I don't know what the asks were at that level. My preference was always that, in terms of on a personal level, Bernie and Cardi B in the salon is much more effective than Cardi B doing a set for us at an event. It is much more effective as to have that Instagram moment than it is for Cardi B to be performing an event for us.
So looking back at both what ended up being the kind of demographic reality of who we needed and who didn't come out, and then also reflecting on what ended up happening in Senator Turner's race. What would you do differently, or what would you advise the campaign to do differently in terms of accessing some of those demographics, namely older voters, Do you think it's possible? I mean, you've articulated some of the difficulties in getting above 65 voters in terms of them being less receptive to Medicare message or Social Security message, rather. But 45 to 65 is a really sweet spot that it felt like sometimes the campaign almost didn't really go for, because there was almost a fetishization of the fact that we had this young cohort. And, we would brag about how the young people are with us in a way that sometimes I think obscured the extent to which we needed the middle group to get with us.
I think we would have liked the middle group to be with us. I think the reality is Bernie winning did require a change in the electorate that we did not. That change would have occurred. The moment that change occurred, what was interesting to me is if you kind of look at public polling with this, there was a shift after Nevada for like 5 days in that world, that when there was this like tiny moment where like that group specifically was like, oh, Bernie might be president. That's not so bad. And we didn't even talk about this. Then we faced, and what was a critical mention to the study at the time, it was like in 3 days, we faced 78 million we faced 78 million in negative earned media, which is, by the way, also unheard of. You had Chris Matthews comparing Bernie to
Bernie supporters to brown shirts.
You had Chuck Todd doing that. You had just out.
He's gonna decapitate. He's gonna get decapitated in Central Park.
You had a CNN host literally the weekend of Super Tuesday, you had a CNN host the weekend of Super Tuesday say, "Is Bernie like the coronavirus?" Was literally the chyron on CNN. Which, by the way, in an age where like people are calling out progressives for being anti-Semitic. There is one of the oldest anti-Semitic tropes in the world is comparing Jews to a virus and disease.
Well, let's not get started on Bernie, the anti-Semitism that everybody ignored about Bernie.
Yeah, and
remember the day that someone brought a swastika flag to a rally and the entire news coverage was Elizabeth Warren talking about snakes on TV? That was like within like the same week of each other.
Yeah, because
there was a rally. There was the Arizona. Swastika at a rally. Yeah. And then Rachel Maddow spends an hour talking to...
That was her post-campaign interview. And so, the other one, which I got into a public spat about that. Brianna knows, and she's actually critiqued me for this. Like, I don't fight with people on Twitter. You told me once I need to fight with more people on Twitter.
That doesn't ring any bells for me. I've never encouraged people say that they see me on Twitter and I always apologize. I follow you on Twitter. My response is always, I'm sorry.
I don't but one of the times I got into a huge blowout and then on the phone got into a huge blowout with a bunch of reporters about this, was Politico in like May ran this story like Bernie's secret millions. And they literally had Bernie with the money tree. And I like lost my mind. And let me state, by the way, that was not, and this goes to the problem, that the article itself, it was bullshit, but it was fine. There was nothing in the article. Like, it was bullshit.
I don't even remember. I just remember all the illustrations.
Yes. The article was like Bernie owns 3 houses. Like,
and there was like a house on each shoulder. Yeah. He had house epaulets.
But then the editors did the headline, Bernie's secret millions, which has an implication. And then literally that combined with Bernie standing in front of a money tree. Where I had, and I will say, like, I do know for a fact there were a number of Politico reporters who went to their editors and were like, "We are uncomfortable with this. Like this crossed the line, guys." And Politico refused to black off. CNN never said anything about their morning host. Had literally, is Bernie and coronavirus? Is Bernie like the coronavirus? And this was like pre Super Tuesday, so this is like early. This is before lockdowns or anything like that. Comparing Bernie to a disease. You had NBC did apologize and Chris Matthews did apologize for their things. And I actually do believe...
Retired.
Retired
got
because
pushed
something
out
else after that.
Yeah.
But I did actually speak with Chris after that privately, and I actually do believe he legitimately... a lot of times I think it's BS. I actually legitimately believe he was sorry for what he said.
But why did he do it?
Because he's...
That's an insane thing to say.
I know, but he's like... You have to realize he was like... insane. like that's it. He kind of just like runs, and then like he will try to make a historical, and like I think I very most of the time I think apologies are in bad faith. I actually legitimately believe his apology was in good faith in that case, having had a private conversation with him about it after it. And it's not like I'm friends with Chris Matthews in any way.
Because I was going to say, you got to get him to come on Bad Faith and discuss.
Yeah, he should come. What else is he doing right now? He's got like a book to promote. He should come on Bad Faith. No, to be honest, if I were him, I would, because I actually think it would be an interesting conversation. I think he's got a lot of issues going on, and that's why he is off TV. I do think, but we did have a campaign where I think in many ways, it's not that we underestimated it. I just think we underestimated, I don't want to say why you underestimated, because I think we thought about this from the beginning, but like you take the Bernie campaign in stages, like we launch, right? And all the focus for January, February, March, April, May is kind of Kamala Harris. And this isn't actually about Kamala, but, you know, in the beginning of the campaign, January, February, March, April, May, I had a reporter at a major news outlet literally tell me that his bosses just thought Kamala Harris was going to be the nominee, and they were going to put their resources, because outlets make decisions about coverage, and they'll put, because it costs money to send journalists here, journalists there. And like, we saw who was covering what. And the reporter was very honest with me. And this reporter isn't even a Bernie like fan. It's just, we have to have a business relationship with these people in a way. And they were like, yeah, my editors and my editors / producers, however you want to put it, don't want to spend the money covering Bernie. Right. And that leads into the Bernie blackout, which became very real kind of in the summer after the debate. So then May comes along, and like Warren like surges with, she's got a plan for that. I think she surges with, she's got a plan for that. Like, it was actually a good message for the time, and it fit her.
It would have been great if she had any follow through on any of those plans and had been able to define the implementation of those plans without coming off as warbly and inconsistent.
Yeah, the problem was she ended up like, we could talk about the Medicare for All moment on the campaign with her, because I actually think that's a very, there are 3 moments where I look at the Warren campaign, and I remember at the time looking at the Warren campaign and are like, holy shit, I cannot believe they're messing this up, but we can get to that in a second. So we get into the Bernie blackout, which we are actually fairly vocal about, both online, like, and in other ways, and behind the scenes, kind of calling people like.
It was worse than people know. I want people to know that. I remember
it was terrible.
At one point, Warren was thriving. She was hitting that maternal mortality rate. Yeah. That became like the thing to say if you wanted to show that you cared about Black people and were woke and intersectional and all of the things. So she was hitting that really hard. Bernie had written an op-ed about the Black maternal mortality rate. And
Who wrote that op-ed?
Bernie did it and was trying to get it placed in Essence. And I remember being told explicitly that we weren't running, it was too early. We weren't running any candidate op-eds at this period of time. Actually, maybe it was a Nina Turner op-ed, now that I think about it, not a Bernie Sanders op-ed. And the excuse was, we're only doing candidate op-eds, not just general surrogate op-eds or anything like that. And like a day after I was told that, Essence announced that they were doing Kamala's Corner, like a weekly editorial from Kamala Harris.
And look, and on the road, you saw like, we had our embeds with us all. So the way campaign road journalism works, for people who don't know, with the networks, there are embeds who are 20 to 25-year-old, sometimes a little bit older, network staffers, and they literally carry around kind of small handheld cameras, and they're with you 24 hours a day. And in a lot of ways, they just become kind of they are with the campaign more than most staffers. They're like, I actually personally loved our embeds as people. They were all like great actual human beings, and like they were fun to deal with, and like but they were with us 24 hours. Like, I went 6 months where they were more a part of where Gary Grumbich was more a part of my life than my wife. Shout out to Gary, of NBC. Because they're with you 24 hours a day. They're with you, but the network really doesn't take it live unless, in our case for NBC, unless Shaq is with us. Mm-hmm. Unless it's CNN, Ryan Nobles is with us. Is Sydney Ember from the New York Times, who was our beat reporter, traveling with us? Mm-hmm. Is Sean Sullivan from the Washington Post, who was our beat reporter at the Post, traveling with us? Because if Sean Sullivan's not traveling with us, we're likely not getting a story written. If Sydney's not traveling with us, we're not getting a story written. Now, in some ways, there was a small advantage to this. Mm-hmm. In the way I like to describe that advantage is Elizabeth Warren's surging, right? She starts taking all this headwind. And I think in the case of Nina's campaign, Senator Turner's campaign, she was out front the whole time taking like massive headwind. Because of the Bernie blackout, we got to and because of where we stood in the polls, few people know I'm a NASCAR fan, which I know is weird for a Jew from Long Island to be a NASCAR fan. You know, if you're riding in if the cars are going around Daytona during the Daytona 500, and there are three cars lined up, first, second, third, which car's moving the fastest?
I don't know. This is like a drag issue?
Yeah, well, it's basic physics. The car in third place is actually moving at a faster speed than the car in first place, because the car in first place is taking 200 miles an hour of headwinds in their face. So now the problem is that was nice in kind of June, and then in August it became like
it was scary.
It was scary because how much are they going to ignore us, and how much are they going to count? And when they weren't ignoring us, they were just counting us out.
Yeah.
And there were all those like, oh my God, Joe Biden's in first and Elizabeth Warren's in third.
Yeah.
Who's in second?
Yeah.
And I think like we were screaming loudly from within the campaign. I think and it was something we talked, like it was, and I think our supporters were actually the best at this. And I have to say, thank God for them, because they were screaming loudly about it, but it didn't really turn around until the AOC endorsement was what really kind of, oh shit, we have to cover Bernie again.
Yeah. I mean, the heart attack, which everyone was very enthusiastic to cover.
Yeah.
And then the comeback scene.
That was, and I have to say it was, I don't think the heart attack for me is such like an emotionally fraught moment. Because first off, like, let's be clear, like Bernie and me spent 3 years on the road together, pretty much constantly. Like, he was my boss. He was also somebody I was friends with. Like, we had a social relationship as much as anybody has a social relationship with Bernie, because we had 1,000 dinners together. And most of those dinners, we don't spend most of our time at the end of a 12-hour day talking about the campaign, right?
And did you spend most of your time talking topic-wise, high level?
A lot of stuff. A lot of it actually was about the campaign, because whoever was with us at the end of the day, he'd want to like wrap up with. But like, you know, you talked with Bernie about everything from like some sports to like old episodes of Saturday Night Live that he liked to watch to like movies to, you know,
what movies is Bernie Sanders watching?
Bernie watches some movies. He likes like older stuff. Like, but you know, he's a multidimensional individual who is not just the person on the stump. And so first off, somebody who is your friend, who you are incredibly close with, who you basically spend all your time with, is now having a heart attack. Also, I don't think people, like, there were two pieces of this. One, there was never like a catastrophic moment. So it was this very slow motion. Like, he was never unconscious. He was always talking. And like, you know, we're in the car and it's just Jesse and I with him. And like, it's very clear that he needs to go for medical attention.
Because it started to happen while he was on stage in an event.
Yeah, and
he asked for a chair, which he never does. He always stands up, and that was the first clue that something was amiss.
To me, that was in my head, like, holy crap, something's really off here. And then we got in the car, and there was a whole, and you know, we get to I don't need to go through the whole scene, but you know, the end of the scene is kind of, to skip to the end, like, I walk into his hospital room at like 1 a.m. after all this is done. They get him out of the procedure. They take him up to the hospital room. walk in, myself, Charla, Jesse are with him at that time, and we walk in, and like the first thing he does is like make a joke about Charla being there, which because Charla was with him in South Carolina when he bumped his head, and he was basically like, "Oh, so every time I'm with you, I end up in the hospital, huh?" And like the color had returned to his face, and he was immediately up, and like I was like, "Oh, okay, he's health-wise gonna be fine." Like you could just tell from that moment. Doctors like, we need to like examine it. And then like I went back, I showered, I came immediately back, and like I was letting him sleep. And at like 6 a.m. the doctor went in to see him, and then like I walked into his room, and all the tubes were gone. So it wasn't even like, it was like he was like kind of just sitting in the hospital bed with only I don't even know what the finger thing that they have on, and that was no tubes, no things, no oxygen. And I was like, oh, okay, he's gonna be okay. And like, it just like that 40 hours was, and that 40 hours ends with AOC calling and being like, I'm going to endorse. And we were like, now? Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. But the press like basically stopped paying attention to us through the heart attack. From the heart attack through the debate was like, will he be able to stand up? Will Bernie survive? And then the debate, he comes out of the debate kind of.
It was a good debate.
It was a good debate. Because he rises to those moments, and he comes out on stage at the debate, feisty as ever. And then at the end of the debate, it's like the perfectly timed leak of, oh, guess what's happening? So the whole spin room was about that now. Which
all the endurance, not just AOC, but the rest of the
all the post coverage is, oh my God, the squad's coming out for him. Oh, we have this big event in New York, everybody. It was this like. And then suddenly everyone has to come to New York, and we had to build like extra pressurizer to accommodate people. When like 2 weeks before we were in like Denver, and the pressurizer was virtually empty.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I won't get into it, but having to fight with an editor who went on to being let go from this publication because of disparaging remarks he made about Senator Turner and myself, but having to go head to head with him because he insisted that an article they had published that said Bernie wasn't going to be able to make the debate, the following debate, which cited him as an expert, was kosher. And I was like, well, you don't know that average recovery time for a stent procedure is 4 days. The debate was like 10 days out.
Let me point.
What are you doing?
Let me point out there was this time on the campaign. The strangest look Bernie ever gave me on the campaign was probably my truest statement to him. When at one point I just turned to him like, you're fucking Wolverine. Like the guy is not like, if we can be blessed with like if I am 78 years old and as hell, there's just no way that's ever happening. Like the guy has like remarkable healing power. I don't understand it.
Well, let's talk about that day, because we've kind of, I think in other times of this podcast talked about what an important moment the rally was that turned everything around. And in this moment, the perception of AOC and some of the squad members on the left is very different than what it was when she came through at a crucial time in a way that I think it's not overstating it to say might have just completely turned the fortune of the campaign around. And she didn't have to do that.
I heard somebody on another podcast basically say she endorsed Bernie when it was easy. And I'm like, that is false. She endorsed Bernie at the lowest. We were in 4th place in Iowa. We were trailing the polls. And he's literally sitting in the hospital recovering from a heart. He was still, when she called, he was in the hospital. Right.
And I don't want to diminish, AOC gets all of the credit on that one. But also Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, them all coming out like that.
Them and from what I've heard, others had made, I don't know what the dynamic was behind the scenes with the squad, but that others had basically made the decision already as well.
Right. I heard that as well. And so, remember, Elizabeth Warren had been strong up until that point. In a lot of respects, she, I think, was a good fit for someone like AOC in terms of the way that she was running her campaign, the way that she was very agile with talking about redlining and certain identity issues and a lot of the stuff that makes it easier for a younger generation of politician to kind of glom onto without having to deal with Bernie's kind of slower moving, his steady march of kind of saying the same thing, which I think personally is effective, and I think actually more politically effective and relates more to the populace. But to your point, I think, yes, there was a lot of good reasons for them to go with someone like Elizabeth Warren at the time. So credit where credit's due. However, since that moment, we had the campaign ending, Bernie dropping out and endorsing Joe Biden with some alacrity, which is something that I want to talk to you about, the timing of that and what you think was gained there, leverage-wise. But that is a question that also dovetails with force to vote, which is, it does seem like there are these moments where progressives don't use leverage that's at their disposal. At this point, when we're talking about force to vote, we're talking about the fact that there is such a narrow margin in the House that a small group of progressives could hold up anything indefinitely for concessions. Same is true now in the Senate with Bernie Sanders. Any one vote can be dispositive in that respect. We all see that happening with Joe Manchin, but it tends not to happen on the left swing. And at the end of the Bernie's campaign, there is an argument that a longer period of time post dropping out before endorsing Biden could have achieved more in the way of concessions and really put a real threat onto Joe Biden, given how there is a very strong 30% support for Bernie Sanders that could be dispositive in a general election context if Bernie wasn't sufficiently enthusiastic about supporting Joe Biden. So should he have done more to try to get concessions out of him at that point when Joe Biden needed his support the most?
I think there are a few, when we talk about this, because let's start with force the vote and all that, because I want to jump back for a second.
Sure.
Not jump back in time, but kind of broaden out the question. Because I think there are several problems that lead to the fight that occurred over force the vote that I think are important, and this is just as I observe it. Like, I have kind of a general rule about how I conduct myself, and people can have differences of opinion. I don't critique activists for doing activism unless they cross like a real red line, like if you're racist or anti-Semitic, I'm
I
gonna
think
call
that's
your
a good
shit
rule.
out. But if activists are doing, I, as somebody who has primarily worked inside during my career, recognize that I need activists. As a progressive, I actually want activists throwing fire. Mm-hmm. Even if it's at me, because look, it's like, it benefits the whole system to have people without the institutional stakes in the process, creating different institutional stakes in the process. And so I always get a bit skeptical when people who are more insiders critique activists for doing activism. Mm. There's a second element here, which I think gets into the force to vote thing, which bugged me at the time. I think you and I had a conversation a few months after about this. And it's, I get kind of, there's a core at the critique of force to vote that is 100% correct and leads into kind of the fight, not the force to vote strategy, which we can, let's just.
Well, what's the core? Tell me the bits where we're right.
No, the bits where we're right is like the bits where it's not about right or wrong, because there's just a general fact that the general fact is there are bits of leverage.
Correct.
The question is, how do you use that leverage? Mm-hmm. The general fact is that outside voices are never going to have an inside perspective and therefore are always going to push that leverage. To me, that's actually, it's uncomfortable for people on the inside. It is.
As it should be.
As it should be.
That's why they call it leverage. But when
you're on the inside, when I'm on the inside, when you work out, looking as somebody who, let's be honest, not doing that recently. But when you work out, you feel a little, your muscles hurt a little bit.
Mm-hmm. No pain, no gain.
No pain, no gain. And the fact is, progressive movement doesn't have the leverage of large donors. Mm-hmm. We don't have the leverage of inside institutions, which is actually something I want to talk about vis-a-vis Medicare for All for a second, because I actually think this is important, but I'll get there. Let me get there in a second. So the fact that activists are going to make people like me uncomfortable, yeah, it sucks, right? But it's a good thing that it sucks. Because let me get too comfortable, and like, I'm not saying this about me, I'm using me in the royal like system, but let people get too comfortable and they will be too comfortable, right? And that's not good. And second, if progressives want activists doing something and you're saying, I don't like that you're doing X, the answer isn't stop. The answer is
provide an alternative.
Provide an alternative. And I think the problem on Medicare for all, the problem that it's not a problem, actually, it's the wrong word. With Medicare for all, there is a core group of activists in this country. It's not a giant number, but it is a relatively large number. It's not like 40% of the country, but there is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who are passionate, who their single issue is Medicare for all. And if you don't give them, the healthcare system sucks. And let me tell you, like, I had to go on the exchange to buy healthcare this month. It was like, honestly, and I have the financial means to buy my healthcare, and it was a terrible process.
It's not good.
It was like, and like, I ended up calling somebody at HHS who I knew and being like, what the hell, man, your process sucks. And they were like, well, that's the DC exchange, Ari.
So Billy, it's going to help me fill out my...
I literally had to reach I literally end up having to reach this person at the DC Health Exchange who was, once I reached the right like person, they were like supremely helpful in getting it done. And the woman was like, gave me her like cell and was like to solve the problem. But the fact is it took me 8 hours of like back and forth phone calls. This person, you got to call this person. Oh no, you got to leave a message. And finally, like, who the hell has 8 hours to be on the phone?
Nobody.
And if I didn't, I would have just given up and ended the month without healthcare. But I was just like, it was like a mental day where it's like, I'm gonna find this person. And like, that's hell, right? Our system is crazy, and and I mentioned this to you on text. I'll say this thing because here's what makes our system most crazy for people. We have a socialized medical system in this country. And let me explain that. Currently, in this country, right, of people who have healthcare, 80 million of them are on Medicaid. 50 million, some overlap between Medicare and Medicaid, but 50 million people are on Medicare. That's between 110 and 120 million people when you account that certain people are on both Medicare and Medicaid at the same time. So there's some overlap in those numbers. They are on publicly funded healthcare. So that's 110 million people in your country are on publicly funded healthcare. Well, Ari, that's only 110 million. What about the rest? Okay. So then you have 150 million people getting employer-sponsored healthcare. That's publicly funded healthcare. Let me explain. Your employer gets to write off their side, which is in their taxes, which is 30%, which means you're basically subsidizing 20 to 30%. And you get to write off your thing on your side if it's pre-tax and it's an employer-sponsored plan. So you get 20 to 30% subsidy from the government for your healthcare. So you're getting a form of socialized medicine. And most people on employer-sponsored healthcare are like, I'm not getting so. Yes, you are. The reason you have that is because the tax code, as it relates to corporations and individuals, allows you to use your taxes to subsidize that purchase of healthcare. Plus, you have the exchange and the rules around it. Now, it's a totally shitty system because you're on this crappy private insurance that even at best is a hellish system. Then you have the people on the exchange who are purely on, most people on the exchange, the vast majority of them, get some form of subsidy to be on the exchange. So they are and a lot of people are almost like, some people now are paying like $50 a month premiums for a shitty fucking plan that doesn't get you, but the government's paying basically a lot of their premiums for a lot of people on the exchange.
Right.
So they're all in the pocket. And by the way, now Cobra's subsidized too because of that. So basically there's like me who like pays my full insurance premium, and probably you at this point who pay
crappy private plan, but
for a crappy private plan. And we're like the only two people in America who don't have socialized medicine. And the problem is that socialized medicine sucks because it's run by a system that literally wants to kill you.
Right.
And
so that's the case.
So that's
and
the
we
case.
have
people
passionate about
it. And if the leaders, and here's the problem, for basically a lot of people became passionate about this from 2015 when they realized, and this is where Bernie does and should, and people shouldn't discount that credit, that Bernie is the catalyst for a lot of people basically being like, wait, a better system is fucking possible.
Right.
And a lot of people stepping up and saying, oh, wait, this actually could be a political reality. It's not just some random senator from Vermont introducing a bill that nobody gets. And then like a serious, by the way, a serious legislative process in 2017 with Pramila and Bernie and John Conyers' office to rewrite the bill into what it is now, which is a real piece of legislation, which was very different than, not that it wasn't a real piece of legislation, but it's a much more put together, formalized piece of legislation, which opens you up to critique, but it's also important to have something real. And now the Bernie campaign ends, which is, look, that is a rational saying, if you want Medicare for all, you got to support Bernie. That is a rational kind of activist thing. Why? Because the easiest way to get Medicare for all is to have a president who basically says, I'm going to, that's like thing. Bernie campaign ends. We elect the Democratic Party nominates and we elect a president who, let's remind you, turns to like Adi Barkan in that video and is like, I don't support, like looks at a guy who is basically has locked-in syndrome.
Correct.
Who is like, I need Medicare for all. And he's like, well, I don't support that. Like,
correct.
That's who we elected.
Said he would veto it.
Said
if
he
it
would
came
veto
to his
it.
Desk.
It said that he would veto it if it came to his desk, and won't, like, will not allow his administration to put the work in that you kind of need to even launch a legislative process to do it, right? So now the question is, what do activists do? And if leaders don't provide, and frankly, and look, it's a difficult question, right? What should these activists do to make Medicare for all happen? But you cannot be angry at activists for being like, that's correct. Where I get
and the point you were
upset.
making initially is that they did not provide an alternative. And I think very explicitly, a lot of people during Force the Vote were asking, like, people who talk about this as though it was some initial antagonistic volley against squad members are really missing the trajectory of how this panned out. What happened was people started talking about this experimental idea that was part of the DSA platform to try to leverage votes for floor vote for Medicare for all. People started talking about it on the internet, and at a certain point, Justin Jackson tagged in AOC, and she offered a response to an explanation as to why she didn't want to do it. That ended up, history bore out that didn't make any sense. She said she was reserving the leverage for fights like the $15 minimum wage, over which they also did not withhold the vote. Whether or not
that in a second, because that's a different.
Sure, but that was her stated explanation. Yep. And then later on, when it came to 1-6, she ended up putting out a tweet that point by point was the exact reason for why you would want to have a forced vote, but she was willing to do it for 1-6, despite knowing that it wasn't going. You weren't going to impeach the former president, but didn't want to do it for Medicare for all. And that was what frustrated people, because Justin Jackson in that moment said, okay, well then what's the plan? What's the alternative?
Right. What's the plan?
And no alternative was ever presented.
And I think the problem is, right, at a federal level, like the honest like answer from like at a federal level with a president who's like, I don't want to do that, it's probably not going to happen. And now that doesn't mean
is whether or not Joe Biden in the next 3 years passes Medicare for all. No. The question is, are you going to continue to do the work to move the public and to put as much pressure so that whoever comes in that seat next,
and a recognition now, there has to be a second recognition that if you're not going to do the work from the inside, activists are going to do the work for you, and you are not going to be able to tell those activists, like, once you forego that leadership position, you can't tell people just
sit on their hands.
To sit on their hands. And I'm not talking, and let me be clear, I'm actually not talking about like the online debate and the YouTube debate. I want to put that to the side because there are personalities there, whatever.
I don't want to separate those two entirely, though, because a lot of the pushback against the online activists was that they weren't organizers and they weren't willing to get offline and do things in real life. And I don't know that those organized marches would have happened without the input in work and organizing efforts from a lot of those people. And you can say it wasn't enough and they weren't big enough and they didn't do a good enough job.
But does it hurt? Like I look, and I wasn't paying close enough attention, but there are two aspects that I think do come into play here, right? And I do think there is a significant deficit with Medicare for all right now that I think we need to does need to be fundamentally addressed in terms of how things get passed in DC and power structures.
Okay.
And I actually think it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and it's let's take like the climate debate versus Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. There is a ton of climate infrastructure actually, you know what a better one is? Just because it's actually a lot cleaner, is let's do like antitrust stuff. There's been an oddly, like people would say, a ton of progress made in the Biden administration on antitrust stuff, but there's almost no grassroots activism on antitrust. There's not like, there's people who care about it, but there aren't antitrust marches. There are Medicare for all marches. What does exist with antitrust, which doesn't exist, is a very progressive and leftist intellectual infrastructure in DC, centered around people like Lena Khan, who's now on the FTC, Matt Stoller, Barry, I'm losing his last name, but who spent years building up an intellectual infrastructure in DC. When we were doing Medicare for All in 2017, when writing the bill, and Lori and Marissa and other people in Bernie's office really hemming down to write the bill, there was so much work they had to do that was on their backs. And a lot of it is that, like, normally, hey, I'm writing this big piece of legislation that impacts 20% of the economy. I need to know this number, this number, this number, right? So you go to this think tank, mm-hmm. and they give you, oh, okay, yeah, here's the number. There's nobody. There's literally nobody in DC to do that.
But what difference does that
in terms
make
of power?
Ari?
In terms of, I'm just
Sure.
what it makes is. Look, I'm just saying it doesn't make a difference in the activist strategy. I'm saying I want to get Medicare for all done, and
you're saying that it's because we don't have this intellectual.
No, I'm saying I'm not saying it's because I know it's not 100%. I'm saying we don't have an activist deficit. Our activists are actually like really good on this. Like, and we have activists willing. We have proven we have activists willing to go to the street. Mm-hmm. We do not have, and this is very hard to build because we do not have. There isn't any institutional support, and by institutional I don't even mean insider institutions. I mean mm-hmm. the policy making is done through this infrastructure of institutions, be it think tanks, foundations, experts, people at universities, and all that. Mm-hmm. And in places where there has been policy success, right, there is institutional backing for those policies in a way that doesn't exist. I hear
you, Ari, but here's my pushback.
Impossible to get done.
I can't do. Do you think that Joe Biden?
Yeah.
Would say that. Why do you think this? What do you think is the rationale for why Joe Biden has been so vociferously against Medicare for all and said he would veto it and all of them?
Because Joe Biden fundamentally is a Democrat of the kind of 1980s. And no, you asked me philosophically.
Not philosophically. Sorry. I mean practically, realistically.
Because he believes it. I legitimately think.
Okay, why does Jim Clyburn weigh in South Carolina? And is there any relationship between the fact that Jim Clyburn takes more pharmaceutical money than anybody else in Congress and the fact that he's on Team Joe Biden? Is there any relationship between the fact that Joe Biden took more billionaire money and money from those industry groups than anybody else and he's the president of the United States of America?
I think there's a chicken and egg question here, which, look, I don't know is the answer, but you just said, yes, these inside institutions and elite institutions, right, are here, and there are no matching institutions on the other side.
Right, but I'm talking about interest groups.
But those interest groups
aligned against the interests of American people, but who have lots of money.
Yes.
And so it's not that I'm not against, I'm not against the idea of there being think tanks that drill down what Medicare for All actually looks like upon implementation. But that seems to be a little bit like a third tier concern when you have someone who is openly hostile to the idea. I don't think that if we had the Medicare for All think tank, suddenly we would have healthcare stuff in the infrastructure
first off, we wouldn't have suddenly. The problem is nothing is suddenly in the city. Second,
if we had a history of 30 years of people working on healthcare infrastructure.
In a way that wasn't, look, I think the Democratic Party, right, got obscenely scared of healthcare after the institutions of the Democratic Party get obscenely scared about healthcare after 1994, right? In an obscene and irrational way, right? After Hillary Care goes down, right? And what ends up happening in 2008 is during the 2008 campaign, Obama, and this is in the kind of thing, and Hillary kind of go at it about healthcare. Obama kind of gets backed into doing healthcare to challenge Hillary because Hillary was literally saying, I'm going to do healthcare in some way that we wouldn't have liked. But Sheik was kind of out the gate. Obama says, no, I'm going to do healthcare. They get into a crazy fight about the individual mandate. People forget about that, where Obama was like, I will never do an individual mandate. It is terrible. It's awful for, literally sends out direct mail pieces attacking Hillary for proposing an individual mandate. Gets into office, does a plan with an individual mandate. And then you have this Obamacare process where, by the way, where you end up in this process where the White House makes a decision, the way they're going to get it done, right, is by buying off a bunch of those institutions, which was the wrong way to go about it. But they decide we're going to make all these people a lot more money so they don't scream. So we're going to limit the number of people who are screaming and yelling at us. Mm-hmm. And that's how they get that done. I think, what do I think about Joe Biden? I think Joe Biden comes out of a mentality that comes from that history. Do I think he is opposed to Medicare for All and these? There are cases where I do think people take positions because of donor money. And there are the reverse cases also where donors give money because a candidate has this position. Mm-hmm. And those two things, the corruption doesn't matter because it's corruption, but those two things happen. I think Joe Biden my perception is he legit, if there was a billionaire who, the test is, if there was a billionaire who's like, Joe Biden, I'll give you $1 billion for your campaign if you do Medicare for All, would Joe Biden be for Medicare for All? I don't think so, actually.
I think that's right, too. But I also think that the obstacle, if it's ideological, either way, whether it's driven by money or it's ideologically rooted in him.
Ideologies are, that's the thing. Ideologies are malleable, right?
So you're saying the ideologies are malleable by an infrastructure, an healthcare infrastructure kind of team, intellectual team in DC, but not by the activists?
It's both. And the problem is, the debate about climate has shifted over the past 15 years because both have existed. The debate about antitrust shifted because it's not a public issue. And there was an infrastructure in DC that could compete with the corporate interests who are aligned against it because there's no grassroots fight there. It's like a corporate interest versus an intellectual interest kind of there. What I'm saying is, in this case, a purely grassroots movement, which is important and vital, and by the way, isn't something DC should or can control. I this is the thing that, Elizabeth Warren gets obscenely wrong when she was like, Bernie sent his people after me on Medicare for All. No, they believe that. We didn't say, if we had told people to stop, they would have just been pissed at us.
Right.
There are grassroots activists because the healthcare system in America kills people. And what I'm saying, only thing I'm saying is it's not enough. What I'm saying is, and that means they should keep going. And this is what I'm saying. It is the responsibility of people like me. I'm putting this on people. You have to understand what I'm doing is putting responsibility on people like me and people in DC who have been in the city for a long time to figure that shit out. Because right now, the honest, good faith answer about Medicare for all. And the biggest problem, and it makes me fucking sick to my stomach to say this, is there is not a path to get it done with the current occupant of the White House and the current makeup of Congress. And that doesn't mean stop doing activism. That means do activism harder.
Right. To me, that's like, obviously,
Right.
and I'm not upset with you, Ari,
No,
but
I
it's
know.
like literally everybody knows that, but there's an attitude taken toward activists that to be a healthcare activist in this moment in a Biden administration is to be some kind of cuckoo pants, like, person who's out of touch with reality.
I'm
and
saying,
it's like, no, the activists understand the reality on the ground and they are forging ahead because Biden is only going to max be around in the short term.
yes.
So,
and
the reason people are upset is because it's not because Biden's a president and we're not going to get healthcare in the next 3 years. It's because the entire infrastructure has stopped. You have, Our Revolution rebranding, expressly in the course of the last week as taking a step back from these bigger projects and saying, we are going to take an incrementalist approach. Now, you can say while Biden is president, we are going to focus in the short term on lowering Medicare age and all these other kind of things. But that doesn't have to happen at the same time you drop the bigger objectives.
I agree. And by the way, look, I think it is a mistake what Our Revolution is doing. I don't understand it. People should know that like Bernie really hasn't been explicitly involved in Our Revolution for a long, long time. In like a way, it is an organization founded out of his campaign, but I mean, there are some stories there. But I think that was a mistake, and I think it's a mistake. And here's why I think it's a mistake. There's a story, and I don't even know if it's true, but it's a good story, so let's just stick with it. But I think it's true because I've heard it from people. So there was a point where a bunch of like consultants came into the Audubon Society, like in like I think it's the 90s, and told the Audubon Society, your problem is you limit yourself because you're just about birds.
What's wrong with that?
Right. Well, no, they said like you're just about birds. So what you have to do is become like a generic environmental group. And so they shifted their focus to become a generic environmental group. And like the problem is they started losing a ton of money because you know what?
The bird people are crazy.
Members, the bird people wanted somebody talking about birds.
Yeah.
Right. And the truth is, if you are going to decide as a political leader, and there are rational reasons to make this, like, there are rational reasons to do all these things, but you have to go with the rational reactions, right? There's a rational reason to say, if I'm a member of Congress right now, and we can talk about some of this, I can move the ball on X, Y, and Z, so I'm not going to focus on A, B, and C, right? There is an activist who says, well, I only care about X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to continue doing activism. There also has to be an acknowledgement. I saw this with like, somebody said like, why are they pushing the squad? And like, I am very sympathetic to the position of the squad and actually, like them all personally. And I wouldn't go protest outside AOC's office, for example. But if you're an activist, if you're a progressive activist, who are you probably going to get more of a response from? Joe Manchin or AOC? So there's like, you can't fault, I can say that's not my style of activism, but I can't fault the rationality of there's a rational bit of behavior behind the activism, because Joe Manchin's just going to be like, blow it out your butt. There's the Nancy Pelosi story. I don't know if you know this one. In her first, do you know how Nancy Pelosi got into Congress?
Wasn't it, she was basically it was handed to her because she did fundraising for the person before. I've definitely listened to a podcast about it at some point. There was
a guy who was she comes from a political family in Baltimore. She marries her husband in San Francisco, raises her family, becomes kind of a political fundraiser and kind of like operative out there in that world of like local San Francisco things. The congressman passes. His wife takes over. She ends up with like a vicious case of cancer. And on her deathbed says, Nancy should take my place. Now, she ends up in like a vicious primary battle, actually. It wasn't like handed to her where she got to like march into the seat. Like there's a vicious primary battle taking place. And a bunch of progressive and kind of leftist at the time activists in San Francisco, like kind of roll up and start screaming at her. And like, she turned to them and said, like, her husband was getting very upset about it. And she turned to her husband and said, these people don't understand how insignificant they really are. And
is this like on camera? Is this captured?
This is like in a positive, like hagiographical kind of book about her. Like it's in a book. Like this isn't this, and you could look it up. This has been written numerous times. And I think her husband was the one who like told the story as like a positive somehow. I'm not sure, but it's been in a bunch of books. But like that was Nancy Pelosi, who was elected from San Francisco, has to kind of be, you know, in the Democratic caucus of the like late 80s, early 90s, even 2000s, is on the left side of that caucus because of the makeup of
San Francisco.
Well, also because of the makeup of the Democratic caucus. You have to remember, like when Bernie started the Progressive Caucus, there were like 10 people in it, you know, and during the 90s, it was like the third way, right? Like, but are you going to be able to push Nancy? My point was, are you going to be able to push Nancy Pelosi in a lot of ways, who just said like, who in her first race was like, these people don't understand how insignificant they actually are.
Right.
And look, in a way that's to progressive detriment, because if you don't give out, and my thing would be to leaders is like, either there's like two choices here. If you don't want the pressure, you have to give people an outlet for their activism, meaning the Bernie campaign was a place people could take that activism and legitimately push. And not in, by the way, like in kind of informed consent kind of way, but like manufactured consent kind of way, but a real, you have to, like, people aren't stupid.
So let me ask you this
path.
then, Ari.
Yeah.
Bernie had all the energy. He had all the energy after 2016. He had all the energy at the end of his campaign in 2020. Why did he endorse Biden so quickly after he dropped out of the race? I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. To hear part 2 of this conversation, where a lot of the meaty stuff is, please do consider subscribing at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. We really appreciate your support, and you will get the answer to that cliffhanger. As always, keep the faith.